So it's my honor to introduce Mr. Jeff Rankin this morning. A member of the Monmouth College staff since 1992, Jeff Rankin is a college historian, and he also serves as editor for our college magazine. A lifelong resident of Monmouth and son of former director of admissions, Glenn Rankin, he is our authority, or a authority, on local and college history. After speaking and writing about Monmouth lore and traditions, Jeff continues to write op-ed pieces, guest writing pieces for our local newspaper. Prior to joining the Monmouth College staff, he held a similar position for 9 years at Carl Sandburg College in Galesburg, Illinois. Jeff will talk about the dramatic changes in the campus landscape since many of you were students. In recent decades, both the college and the city have faced unprecedented challenges. Both have seen its ups and downs. There's much on the horizon to be optimistic about, and Jeff will hit on many of those points today. At this time, let me join in welcoming my distinguished colleague and friend, Mr. Jeff Rankin.
Thanks, Steve. I'm really glad to see so many people out here early on a beautiful Friday morning. As Steve said, I am, part of my title now is college historian, which is pretty cool because, you know, I've always loved history, and I've sort of done it on the side since I got here pretty much. And then the president came to me and said, well, you know, do you want to just focus on working on the magazine? I said, that's fine. And then he said, and you can be our historian. So now I can kind of do it without feeling guilty that, you know, I should be working more on this or that. But I do enjoy it, and I feel like having grown up in Monmouth, you know, I've seen the college historically grow and change over the years, and so it's nice to have that perspective. And when you live here all the time, you kind of lose track. It sort of gradually phases in and out, and you don't necessarily step back and look at the dramatic change. And so I'm sure a lot of you who only get here occasionally are somewhat taken aback when you first step on campus. But today I'd like to start out with a shocking revelation, and that is that Monmouth College's campus today is not the campus of your day. And as you can see, just even things as simple as our sign, the college continues to grow and mature, I would say, in a good way. But let's start with a little historical perspective. This is Monmouth in 1869, and Monmouth dates to 1831, and there was really nothing here until 1831. At that time, the Warren County was looking to be created. This was all part of the military tract. It was bounty land set aside for veterans of the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War. So each county, as it populated, they would try to figure out, well, where will the county seat be, you know, what will the form of government be, and all that sort of thing. So Monmouth was a case like that. We had this raw county just being formed. They needed a place for a county seat. And they kind of looked at where all the settlements were within the county. At that time, the county went all the way to the Mississippi River. It encompassed what's now Henderson County. But they looked at all the little settlements and they said, okay, what would be the central point where everybody can get to the courthouse or whatever they needed to do for business? And Monmouth, where it is today, was kind of at that center point. So that's kind of where it started. Now, the first 20 years or so, the town did not grow very rapidly, primarily because transportation was an issue. The railroad did not come in until 1855. And of course, that made a huge difference. But in the early days, there wasn't a lot going on. There was a lot of agriculture, obviously, surrounding Monmouth, and there were some industry in Monmouth. There were plow factories and wagon and some pork rendering and that sort of thing. But one problem was education. Education was a problem. They had some local schools that were just not very well staffed and that sort of thing. And as the town had an eye toward the future, toward growing, education became a priority. And there was a huge interest among the educated elite in town, if you could call them that, to have some kind of an educational institution. And so, of course, the Presbyterians were very much interested in education. They needed a way to train future ministers and lay people as well. So when the Presbyterians in the 1850s started looking forward to how they would educate, a lot of the townspeople said, well, I'll get on that bus and we'll do that together. And that's kind of what has happened in Monmouth, whereas some communities that have a college, they're kind of separated. Monmouth has always embraced its community. It's been a big part of the Monmouth area. So many of our students who have come from far away from the East Coast have chosen to stay here after graduation. We've had mayors of Monmouth that came from far away and went through Monmouth College and kept local and helped the college and the town grow. So this was shortly after the railroad had come in. It was starting to grow a little bit, but again, about 1853 was when the church decided they would try to build some kind of an academy. And Monmouth wasn't the only town searching that. There were several towns, including Oquawka, that wanted some kind of an academy. However, the business people of Monmouth put their money where their mouth was. They solicited funds to create sort of a trump card when they went to decide where the academy would be. And they raised about $1,100 in pledges, and that was what won the day. So Monmouth won the chance to have an academy. However, it was 3 years. The first 3 years, they didn't have a campus at all. They met in local churches, in schoolhouses, various places, but there was no campus. So again, about the time the railroad came through in 1855, things started to change. This was sort of the downtown where the square is now, just to give you some orientation. And this is west, and this is east toward the college. And so one of the leading citizens at the time was Abner Harding, and he had come from the East Coast. He was an attorney, very well-to-do attorney. He was also a capitalist, and he was responsible, along with Ivory Quinby, for getting the CB&Q Railroad through Monmouth. And he wasn't a Presbyterian. Well, yeah, I guess he was a Presbyterian, but a lot of his friends were not, and he was mostly interested in getting a school started. So he actually donated the first lot for the first college, and that was down here on A Street between Detroit and Euclid. And you think about it, you know, it seems like an odd place for a college in a way, but at that time, this was Monmouth. It didn't go east of 6th Street. That was all farmland. So this was kind of prime real estate. And so the first Monmouth College building was built in 1856 on this developing area here. Thanks to Abner Harding. He also endowed our first professorship in mathematics, and he gave a lot of money, lent a lot of money to the college. He was one of the early trustees. Now this is a close-up of the first Monmouth College building, and it was kind of modeled on a New England sort of school or church. The bottom floor was 8 classrooms, and the top floor was, of course, a chapel. And that worked for a little while, but as I said, there was such a need for education, the college grew really rapidly. So within another 3 years, they'd outgrown this. They needed to do something quickly. So as is the case so many times with our alumni, we had some alumni step forward. And as I mentioned, all of this area to the east was just farmland. And a lot of that was owned by 2 brothers from Henderson County, David Graham and his brother Archibald Graham. And they decided they would give 35 acres to Monmouth College if they would build a building. And 10 of those acres would be for the campus, and 25 acres would be for building lots to raise money to build this building. And so this area here is what became known as the college addition to the city of Monmouth. And it's interesting to think about it today. This whole side of town, the whole east side of town, basically grew up around Monmouth College. So Monmouth, you know, the campus today is an influence of, well, the whole part of town is tied really directly to the college and its early development. Okay, so things didn't change a whole lot for the first century or so. We built what was a basic campus, Wallace Hall, where the old main had burned in 1907. Luckily, Carnegie Library was built at the same time, and that helped after the fire to house classes. Right after that, there was a really huge desire to build and get the campus back. So McMichael Science Hall was under construction by 1910. And of course, the auditorium dates to 1896. And an interesting sidelight on the auditorium is it was designed by Dan Everett Wade, an 1886 graduate of Monmouth College, a local boy who's the son of a Monmouth dentist. And he won this was his first major architectural contract, but he went to the East Coast. He became the chief architect for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, very prominent architect. He was president of the American Association of Architects, and he also was going to build the tallest building in the world, which was the new MetLife building, but then the Depression hit and they had to cap it off. But his influence, he loved the college, and throughout his long career, he gave back to the college. He supervised picking the architect for Wallace Hall, and McMichael Hall, and several others. He didn't design necessarily the buildings himself, but he did design our gymnasium in 1925, which at that time was considered really state-of-the-art gymnasium in Western Illinois. And then even after his retirement and his death, his former business partners, Arthur Angley was one of them, kept working and designing buildings for Monmouth College, such as Fulton Hall and Graham Hall and Windbigler. So it's kind of interesting to have an East Coast architect who had a vision for what this college should look like, and a lot of people who are coming from afar think, well, this looks kind of like an East Coast college, it doesn't look like a Midwest college, and I think part of that is his vision for this Georgian style of architecture that was carried out throughout much of our building. Now, that didn't necessarily continue in the 1960s, which was the case at a lot of colleges, unfortunately, but 1965 was kind of a critical year in the future development of Monmouth College. And that was sort of the year that Duncan Wimpress came in as the new president. He'd come in the year before after Bob Gibson had retired. And at that time, the focus was on a capital campaign. The sciences were big. The GI Bill had brought in a lot of students who went on to become chemists and engineers and that sort of thing, geologists. And so science was an important thing. We had this sort of dinky little McMichael Science Hall, which had seen better days. I mean, in its day, it was really a fine building, and the professors had gone again to the East Coast to look at all the latest laboratories, and that was all done. But it was small. It was a growing area, and so they wanted to do something. So the idea at the time was they were going to build on to the east side of that building. And they started to raise funds for this new building that was going to be called Haldeman Hall in honor of William Haldeman. But Duncan Wimpress came and he said, that just doesn't seem like a modern science building. That looks like that's old school. So what I want you to do is abandon all your architectural plans and stuff. We're going to build a new building. And so that's what happened. And that was the impetus for Haldeman Thiessen Science Building, which is, you know, multi-story and modern at the time architecture. So that was built. Now, also at that time, the college's enrollment was growing. It got up to about 1,300 by some of your time in 1969. And so there was a need for more housing, campus housing. Before that, you know, a lot of the men lived off campus. They lived in fraternity houses and that sort of thing. So, mid-60s, you know, we built Cleveland Hall, we built Liebman Hall. After that, we built the fraternity complex, which at the time was pretty controversial, and it still is rather controversial. And we built Gibson Hall over here behind the chapel, and it was different, you know. It was the Holiday Inn, but you know, people who lived there for the next 30, 40 years all loved it. They thought that was a great concept. But anyway, things happened after '69, and among those were, you know, the war started to wind down, so the draft thing wasn't as big of an issue, but also a lot of the East Coast states started developing their own university systems, like New York. And so there was a new alternative for inexpensive education where parents felt they could send their kids. And so suddenly sending them out to the middle of Illinois wasn't quite an option. And then there were other things, there was the oil crisis and everything else. So all of a sudden, you know, the enrollment started dipping. I mean, gradually at first, and then it just started to really tank. And the problem was we had all these new buildings and we had a lot of government debt. We had borrowed from the federal government. So what do? Well, it was tough. So eventually what you do is Graham Hall got closed, and it was used to house mentally disabled people locally. Fulton Hall closed. You know, other dorms were kind of not full. And so it was a difficult time, and kind of remained that way. We had a little bit of bump up in the 80s. DuBois Freed came here in the 70s and kind of helped stem the tide of our financial condition. Actually, early in the 70s, it was a dire time. A lot of people who were here then didn't even realize how dire it was. I mean, the college was this close to folding. For example, Haldeman Thiessen, before it could open, they needed to find the money to pay the contractors. They owed $700,000 on that building. The college at that time was $400,000 in debt. They could not find a bank to lend the $700,000 so that we could take control of that. Finally, they found a bank in Chicago that said, okay, you know, we'll float the loan. So that was how close we were to being not Monmouth College anymore. But yeah.
What was the student population at that time?
It went from, again, like 1,300 in '69 to mid-'70s, it got down in the 600s, so, you know, about half. Yeah. And so, again, in the 80s, President Haywood came in, restructured our academics. Things started to look a little better. Walter Huff, class of '56, gave us $5 million, or was it 5? Yeah, $5 million, which was huge at that time. And that, you know, that helped. Our endowment was, you know, barely an endowment. It was maybe $1 million or something like that. So anyway, things sort of started to stabilize through the 80s. But again, as we went into the 90s, there were a lot of things competing for young college students, and enrollment was still hovering in the 700s. Not so good, and it was becoming more difficult to recruit. You've got an old campus, you've got you know, nothing new. The only thing that was new was in 1990, Wells Theater was built to replace the old Little Theater. And so that was the first academic building in, you know, 20, 30 years. And here we had all these other old buildings. Haldeman Thiessen still seemed fairly new, the library seemed fairly new, but we needed to do something. And what happened was we came up with a plan, and it was called the Monmouth Plan. It became kind of famous. It was copied by other colleges, and the idea was we would make private liberal arts college education affordable to the average student. They would not have to pay more than they would pay at their state flagship university. And that all of a sudden started to work. Things started to click. By the late 70s, the late 90s, let's just kind of look at this. This was the first sort of sign that things were moving. Graham Hall had been, you know, in mothballs for years. It was renovated because we started to have an influx of students. 96, Carnegie Library, it had been somewhat vacant. the student services office was still on the ground floor. The top floor had been used for an experimental theater. It was, at that time, pretty much costume storage for the new theater. And for a while, the bookstore was also on the first floor. But it was not in good shape, so we had a lead gift from Red Polling, class of 49, and it was substantially renovated. And that was our first building that wasn't sort of a residence hall that got some really good attention. And Quinby House, again, things had not been maintained at all. When President Haywood, he was the last president to live there, trees had grown up, the paint had failed, it was just, you know, a mess. So partly through a grant, through a historic state grant, Quinby House was built by Ivory Quinby, who helped bring the railroad to Monmouth. So there was funding from the state of Illinois. There wouldn't be today, but you know, to bring this important historic thing to Western Illinois. So that was part of the funding. It was beautifully renovated, and our next president, Sue Huseman, was our interim president. She never lived there because it was undergoing renovation. But Dick Giese was our next president. 1997, McMichael Residence Hall was renovated. You know, everybody loves McMichael. It was our first real dormitory, built in 1914. It had seen better days, but you know, at the time it was state of the art. The whole top floor had a gymnasium for the women because it was, you know, wouldn't have been right for the women to have to play basketball in the same quarters as men. Of course, the dining hall had been on the lower level. And, you know, the rooms were pretty neat. They had their own lavatories. The corner rooms had a lot of windows. So that was a nice thing when that was finally brought up to standards. And as I mentioned, Dick Giese came in 1998, and that's when things really started to take off. He came from Mount Union College in Alliance, Ohio. He was probably our first president who really understood fundraising. He really had a knack for it. He knew what we could do. Before that, I think we didn't really have a sense of how to go about it, or that we had the capacity to do it as well as we do. So he kind of got us excited about fundraising. And so this was, his big thing is, everybody said before that, the college is landlocked, you can't expand, there's just no way to do it. Well, he said, that's not necessarily so. And so what he did was started looking at the residential area that had grown up around the college and gradually acquiring houses as they became available. And it's kind of historically interesting because originally that was Monmouth College land, and it's kind of going back to Monmouth College. So this was one of the most dramatic things, is all of a sudden some of the city streets started to become other things, and East Detroit was taken out, and you know, luckily some things were saved. This house here is now located directly across the street from this building. So it's, and Jane would know because her husband grew up in that house. But you know, this was, people were looking at this kind of almost in shock, like, what's going on? You know, what's this college doing? You know, it's such a massive undertaking. But again, things gradually, year by year, it got to the point where every summer, if you didn't hear, you know, big equipment and see trucks carrying dirt, and you know, it was part of the summer landscape in the city of Monmouth. Things started small. You know, Stockdale Center got a renovation. The old ATO house became Mellinger Center, which now houses our English department and a writing center. Parking has always been an issue, still is, but one of our first extra parking lots was built across from McMichael Hall. And then 2000, Dick Giese was very much interested in athletics because Mount Union was a national football champion. His first day here, I remember going into his office, and he hadn't really extensively toured the college on his early visits, but he said, I'm going to go out today and really look at our athletic facilities. And when he came back, he was kind of in shock because he just said, wow, we just have the worst facilities. So, you know, he convinced the board, and the board agreed that what we needed to do is attract students quickly, build enrollment. Athletics is one good way to do that. Fitness is becoming much more of a concern, much more interest to the average student and parent. And so there was a big focus on athletic facilities, and so he got Saf Peacock and Betty to give land, or to develop this land out by the highway to build a true baseball field and soccer complex. And what's interesting, the college had owned that land since the 1960s because that was where the new football field was going to be built. Never happened, but eventually it did become athletic. It was an amazing transformation because that was a cornfield. It was on kind of rolling land, and they just, to turn it into what it is now is just phenomenal. Also that same year, Boone House, many of you remember Commander Boone and his wife, just north of campus, conducted East Asian Studies classes in their home, and the Boone family decided we're going to give this to the college. It received some renovation to be used as sort of a retreat center, and some of the museum cases they still had were maintained. In 2001, many of you are familiar with this building, living there this weekend. Bowers Hall was our first real venture into new residence halls. And Dave Bowers, former chairman of the board, I guess he was chairman at the time, decided, this was going to be his legacy. He wanted a place that was really comfortable for students, that had the latest of everything. Suites were sort of the new style, and just made this a magnificent building. And again, this was one of the first new buildings on the western frontier of Monmouth College that had to be vacated in order to make room. So again, 2001, Boucher Plaza, and again, things keep changing because now we have our Scotsman statue here, class of 2015, and we did more renovations inside Stockdale. Again, the old cafeteria line style of eating was abandoned. We went to food stations where students could pick and choose, which was popular at that time. 2002, we didn't necessarily do a lot of original building, but Hughes Library got an amazing facelift. Actually, the building, when it was built in, it was around 1970 when it actually opened, they couldn't afford to finish the second floor, so they left it basically concrete, bare light bulbs, and they stored the government documents up there. So this was an opportunity. I mean, that was foresight, really, by the trustees at the time. Now we had some funds. We're going to go in there, put in art galleries, put in nice stacks and museum area. So that was ready to go. Also, we had no air conditioning because the air conditioning had broken down in the early 70s and the energy crisis. It just was never addressed. So in the summer, it was brutal in that library. But also, what was really innovative was the building was built in a style of architecture that was kind of like the fortress era of architecture, just massive brick walls and no windows. So they actually cut 36 window openings in the library to bring in all this natural light, which just really transformed the place. And we also put in a coffee shop, which is now Einstein. And it made it more of a focus of student life. It was, it had kind of gotten off the beaten path of where students wanted to go. So that was huge. As you'll recall, for years we had tennis courts over by the student union. They were getting a little dated, so it was time to build a whole new tennis facility, which is at 6th and Euclid. And that was $1 million complex at the time. So that whole area was being developed. We now, right above that is the softball field, and we put in 2 football practice fields above that. So all that kind of started to work together, and also there was a parking lot built there to help address the parking needs. And then that same year, we acquired land, 16 acres just to the south of our baseball complex. from Bill LeSueur, class of 43, and developed a nature preserve, which is still developing quite nicely. And it includes a 1 mile trail that you can walk. But there are 4 distinct regions, that, geographic regions that are represented with different habitats. So that really gave the biology department a new focus. Every year they're out there taking out non-native vegetation, planting new trees, working on things, the creek that runs there, enhancing that. So that's a really nice new area for students to explore. Now, 2003 was huge, and that was the opening of our new athletic center, $22 million. Again, Walter Huff came forward and decided he would invest in this in memory of his late wife, Elizabeth. But it was done, I think, with the same kind of careful attention to detail that a lot of our renovations were done. The original gym was pretty much maintained. In 1983, we had built what we called the Glennie Gymnasium, which was kind of a box right next to it. And we had a huge need for a field house. The old Wade pool was kaput, it didn't function anymore, so we got a nice natatorium. But all these things were kind of married together in a very sensitive way. And if you haven't been in the Huff Center, you'll see how, even the old gymnasium, parts of that were kept, like the 4 columns in front of the building. So it's sort of a tribute to the future and the past. And you'll also see we have a lot of tributes to our athletic prowess. We have new banners hanging for our track championships. We have trophy cases that are just filled like crazy. And so, the gymnasium, finally it's got nice, not the old wooden bleachers. We also have an educational wing that's used for offices, and then downstairs we have classrooms. 2004, again, one of the new trends in education is students want to live, they don't want to live in dormitories, they wanted to have independence. So we purchased an apartment complex just east of the college, renovated it, and allowed students to live in apartment-style living in groups. And that's become hugely popular with our upperclassmen. Now, Dick Giese moved on, brought in the Ditzler administration. Roy Ditzler's focus was academics. Giese had been a focus more on enrollment. But it was, enrollment had stabilized. We were up over 1,200 students. We kind of equaled our high point. So it was time to finally move on past the physical campus and look at academics. But we still were looking at need to house our students. So Pattee Hall was another one of our new residence halls. And then some just smaller things that happened along the way early on after Maury Ditzler came. The manor was renovated, and Bonnie Shattuck gave it back to the college. Austin Hall received a makeover. The back behind Walls Hall had been sort of neglected, and we had those steep hills that you used to slide down in the winter. So there was new plazas, new steps, and that sort of thing built back there to beautify and make it safer. Then again, another residence hall, and wonderfully named after Gracie Peterson, who was such an influence, and she actually, one of her former homes stood on that very corner, so it was kind of appropriate. We also built another parking lot. Again, we just have to accommodate students. Parking is a reality for students today. They have to have their cars. And then that same year, Weeks House, named in honor of Stafford Weeks and his wife, was acquired and renovated, and it houses our chaplain's office. We have a chaplain and an assistant chaplain, also our Department of Philosophy and Religion, and they're all about celebrating Sam Thompson and his contributions to philosophy. Now again, athletics still has, even at that time was still an important drawing card. And the old football field was not anything to really write home about. So Walter Huff again stepped forward. He remarried after the death of his first wife. Sadly, his second wife, who was an alum, also died, so he decided he would honor her with a renovation. And we now have a field turf field. We have beautiful suites for the media and the president. And we also have, a video scoreboard and lights. So it's really first class, and it's used not just for, well, now it's used for lacrosse, which we just started, but also the marching band uses it, intramurals use it, and the lights at night allow more options for scheduling the field. Another thing that was somewhat tied to the emphasis on academics was the advent of our educational garden, and then eventually our market farm, which you may have toured yesterday. And then another initiative at that time was our Greek Life Initiative. And the idea was, studies had shown that retention can be helped quite a bit by a Greek Life program that's done right, done properly. And so we decided, we're going to really invest in nice housing that's owned by the college and maintained by the college. We're also going to invest in really good support staff to make sure the fraternities, get the support they need. And so the first new construction was built on the side of the old Woodbine, and it was built in the Queen Anne style to kind of pay tribute to that. The old Woodbine had gone to the Wreckers Ball in the mid-'80s, and so the idea was women had never had their own houses, and it was about time they got them. So Alpha Xi had been gone from campus and had come back. Pi Phi and Kappa obviously were well established, so they all kind of decided, well, if women are going to have the first shot at it, let's let the Alpha Zs do that. Well, that might have come back to haunt them, because all of a sudden Alpha Z has just taken off because everybody loved the new house and wanted that for their headquarters. Things again continued somewhat gradually. The admissions building had been acquired by the college in 1931. In 1957, it had been converted to an administration building for the college, so everything was in this building. We had the business office, physical plant, registrar, admissions, alumni. I mean, it's just amazing. And but we needed a place that was just dedicated to admissions and a warm, welcoming site. So renovations were done. It was made handicap accessible, done quite well, and I think it's a very nice, welcoming place as you come onto campus as a prospective student. Again, our farm thing started to continue, and President Ditzler was a farmer himself. He owned a farm in southern Indiana, and his wife actually spent much of her time there running it. But, he had this vision, we're in a really rich agricultural area. We should celebrate that. We should make a lot of that. And so, we have this beautiful, rich soil. Let's think of ways to address things like food security, futures in agriculture, hybrid plants, all sorts of things. And so this thing continues to evolve, and it's really becoming quite an exciting project. Now, when President Ditzler came, his overall big goal was to build a new science building. He had done that before. And so we started looking at, well, how can we do that? And we also kind of need a new business building, because our business department, it was one of our most popular majors. Accounting was big. But, there wasn't necessarily the potential funding out there to build both of them. So what if we tried to combine the two? Could that work? And the more we thought about it, the more we decided it not only could work, it could work to our advantage. And in other words, let's have a collaborative effort between science and business, which is really the reality of the world today. If you're a scientist, you have to learn how to market your discoveries, and if you're in business, you have to understand the world of science. So that's kind of what gave rise to this. It was about a $43 million project, 138,000 square feet. And, you know, not only does it make Monmouth on the forefront of science and business, but it's also a wonderful attraction to prospective students. There are just so many things that were put into the building. You know, we have an observatory, we have a cadaver lab, which not a lot of colleges have, a greenhouse. There's just all sorts of things, but also it really celebrates, and a nuclear lab, but you know, it celebrates the business, and we do things like our accounting department does income tax through the VITA program, free for the community. So we built rooms so clients can come in there and work with our students to have their taxes done. A more recent thing, a couple of years ago, we were looking to expand our theater department, and we were also looking to partner with the downtown, which has had some challenging times. There were a lot of empty storefronts on Main Street, still are. But one of the developers who was working on that worked with us. We did a lot of the carpentry ourselves for this new experimental theater, and we basically pay rent for the building, but it's our own facility. It was designed by our theater department, and it's quite impressive. It's quite versatile. And then just last year, again, our Greek Life Initiative continued. We had a wonderful grant from the Knapide family to construct a new Pi Beta Phi house. Obviously the first women's fraternity in the world. Here at Monmouth, it ought to be something quite impressive, and this certainly is. And it was, you know, there was a lot of thought and love put into this building. So again, things kept evolving, and again, Dave Bowers, who did Bowers Hall, he saw the need for more parking, so he actually financed a new parking lot, which we're using this weekend. And then sort of the crowning thing this year on our Greek Life, obviously Pi Phi had a beautiful new house. Kappa needed one desperately, and one just fell out of the sky, you know, ready to go almost. A beautiful mansion built in 1896, recently restored by Tim Kefauver, class of 1980, who had been a vice president here and was retiring. So he had done some really wonderful renovation, and now, you know, it's not a brand new house, but it's a gracious house. It's up on a hill. It's, you know, modernized, but still keeps its kind of wonderful old world charm. So just to give you another idea of how things have changed physically, this is sort of a map from the 60s, and it shows where the roads used to go. And so everything that's yellow has now been converted to green space. You used to be able to come up Archer Avenue, and you could drive around, you could drive up behind Wells Hall, or you could drive through in the Student Center and go through to 9th Street and park in front of the Student Center. And then all this whole area, College Place, the baseball field used to be here, and the football field was further down. That was taken out, made into green space, and of course we have our new Center for Science and Business here, and our Huff Athletic Center here. And up here is, of course, our new sort of athletic area. And, you know, at the time, they had talked about, well, we'll go back, College Place. You know, this might be a place we could do some building. We could build some mini fraternity houses or something else. But then when they started looking at it, you know, they said, well, this is a really kind of a neat area. What if we don't build anything here? Let's keep it a quad. And President Ditzler had come from Wabash College, and they had something similar in the middle of their campus. So the idea was, yeah, we'll just keep this kind of green space, you know, keep it open, plant trees, let them become mature. So that's kind of where we're going, and that's sort of the new focus for the heart of campus. So just to give you a sense of the dramatic changes, this is the campus just 17 years ago. You know, we still had Gibson Hall. This was Glen Gym next to the old original gym. You know, the old football field, none of this was really developed. That was pretty much the campus. And now here's the same area, and this is all pretty much developed. We've got our Center for Science and Business here. We've got our Huff Athletic Center. We've got new athletic things here. We've got Founders Village over here in our garden. We've got our farm out here. So it's dramatically, you know, our westward expansion has been a success. And I think what, you know, the takeaway from this is that college campuses continually evolve. Sometimes they evolve very slowly, like that was the case at Monmouth. Then all of a sudden they can evolve overnight. And I'm sure the college will continue to evolve, and it'll be exciting to see 10, 20 years from now what it looks like. But I think it's on the right track. It's among the most beautiful campuses for a small college in the country. I think it's one of our drawing cards for students. So I hope I helped you kind of get a sense of what Monmouth College is today, how it got here, and where it might be going. And I'd be glad to take any questions. Yeah.
What's the population now?
I think the current population is between 12 and 1,300. I don't know the exact, but we're kind of maintaining that right now. Yes?
What's going to happen with the Science Center? Jason?
That is still somewhat up in the air. There's been a lot of theories proposed. One of the issues is we use it as a heating and cooling plant. We have the cooling tower on the roof, and the boilers are in the basement. So if something new were built on that site, you'd have to figure out how to build within those two things or reroute things. So that, you know, but there has been talk it could become a new student center. But again, I think things are still sort of on the drawing board. There's no specific plans at this point. Yes?
I took the walk this morning around the track, and it suddenly came to me, this is the first time I think I've ever been in a football stadium where the home people faced west. In every stadium
That's
after
true.
Big Ten or high school, the backs to the setting sun for an afternoon game. Why did they do it that way?
You know,
I talked to one of the people that works there, and he said, well, it's always been that way.
Well, and it may have something to do with the fact that we had that hill there originally, and that was a natural place to put the home stands. But I mean, the home stands were originally on the west side, and then,
That's what I thought.
yeah.
So he said no, but I said.
Yeah, they were there in the
Like they were.
60s. Now, of course, the field itself was relocated farther north. But yeah, I don't really know what the logic was other than they had kind of, those stands had started to deteriorate. They built some new ones on this side, and they were probably nicer than the visiting stands. And, I don't know. Yes?
Actually, the new stadium was April Zorn's idea. I guess they
Oh,
were together
right.
at dinner or something, and she said something about it. He kicked her under the table. That's the story I heard.
Well, that's great because,
It's a story exists in my.
right, and you know, but it's sort of a fitting tribute that, you know, both of his wives would be honored in different ways. So, yeah. Yes.
With these new global initiatives, themes, is there any thought of possibly housing an institute for global studies or vision together?
You mean downtown or here on campus? I don't know. I think there's been discussion of doing different things. We're having, we're doing some, we got a grant from the Lilly Foundation for, they're calling the Lux Summer Institute for Religious Inquiry, bringing students to campus in the summer, high school students. So, you know, I think there's a lot of ideas, and, you know, we house things like the Classical Journal is published here on campus. Anything that can kind of bring attention to the college as a focal point for future, you know, to bring, you know, so people recognize Monmouth as something other than a place in New Jersey, you know. So I think, you know, it's possible. It just depends on faculty initiatives a lot and, you know, funding and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think there's all sorts of possibilities along those lines. Yes?
Before the new Business and Science Brennan Center, we were told that the highest number of students in majors were, I think, education, maybe business, but that the science department had declined over its, importance when we were.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, has that increased?
It has declined and it is increasing, and I guess you can kind of imagine why it is, but we're having the chemistry department seeing a real rebirth. We have, Richard Keefe was a chemistry professor in the 70s and 80s who passed away, and he left his entire estate to the chemistry department. So that allows things like summer research, going to conferences and that sort of thing. So we've had a dramatic renaissance in chemistry. Physics has always been kind of a difficult thing, but we're getting more students and women interested in physics and also international students. And biology has always been kind of strong, but it's gotten a lot stronger. We have things like the cadaver lab, things like that. So yeah, the sciences, we needed that building to get the sciences back, and they're coming back. And we've had a lot of retirements from older faculty. We're getting some young faculty in here who are just dynamic and want to do things and try new things. So it's quite exciting, yes.
What's the emphasis on technology, computer science, programming, software, et cetera?
Right.
Increasingly, that's becoming a discipline on certain campuses.
It is, and I think that's still a challenge for us. I think, we still have a focus on math, but we haven't addressed the computer science thing as much as we could. I think, that's certainly something we'll want to be doing, we'll need to be doing. Again, a lot of our top computer science students are international students. We've had some Syrian students on campus that have done some really wonderful work in that area. So it's going to be a little bit slow, but we do have the facilities now for that department, and if we can get the mass interest, and the faculty, young faculty coming in who understand it and appreciate it, I think that will continue to grow. Yeah.
Where's the art department now?
Okay, the art department is now in the old McMichael Science Building, and you may remember in the 1960s it was in the old chicken hatchery up here. And they kind of they sort of moved from place to place, but this is really a pretty nice building because it allows for all kinds of studio space. There's actually a foundry in the basement where they can pour molten metal. And there's a wood shop where they can do sculpture and that sort of thing. And tonight, and what used to be the lecture rooms make really nice painting studios. So that works pretty well. The theater department also shares office space in there, so it's kind of a fine arts building. I think down the road that might be an area though where new facilities would be in order. It is an old building, but artists are kind of creative and they like to do new things with old spaces. So. Yeah.
About initially how there were some ebbs and flows in enrollment.
Yeah.
You had some crisis times and then you came back. What are you looking at in the future as potential ebbs? And what are you doing about
Yeah. Well, there are some real challenges, and one of the challenges is obviously the discount rate for students. A lot of colleges are giving a 70% discount rate and that sort of thing. And President Wyatt sees that as critical, that we can't continue to do that and be viable. We have to look for people who have the ability to pay. We have to increase our endowment so we can offer more financial aid and that sort of thing. So even if our enrollment has to suffer for a while, we need to build that up and lower that discount rate. So that's, I think, our biggest challenge. Also, we have so many Illinois students. We had 92% at one point. And when the monetary work program started to not be funded, all of a sudden we had 90-some% of our students not getting funding from the state, so the college had to fill in the gap. And that's a real financial strain. So we've lowered our Illinois enrollment to somewhere in the 70s, is it, Steve?
Well, there'll be 22%, which will be out of state, out of region, this incoming class.
Right, and athletics has been a part of that. We've added lacrosse and water polo, and that draws students from areas other than Illinois. There aren't a lot of Midwest schools that offer co-ed water polo, for example, both men and women. So, you know, we're looking at new ways, we're looking at new territories. I mean, I think Texas, California, Arizona, Florida are some of the areas that, you know, we used to draw from. We used to get from Colorado was big with the church in the early days. And we're starting to see more students from those areas. We'd love to get more from the East Coast like we used to. So, yes.
Dr. Thiessen was my advisor when I was here, so I have a vested interest in this question. I'm told that the Haldeman Thiessen building is now empty.
Correct.
What is the long-term plan for that?
Well, as I was mentioning earlier, it's kind of up in the air. There's talk about it possibly becoming a student center at some point, but kind of unknown. So, you know, there's many different priorities they have to address, and you know, that's one that maybe isn't immediate because there are other things that need to be done, but a student center does need to be done.
Well, there was a lady that I talked to on campus. She said something about the tunnel underneath all the supporting systems that went into building the science building, and it's crumbling, and it's so bad that they can't tear the building down, and that's why.
Well, I think that there's something to it. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so when President Wyatt came in, he came in with an interest in dealing with the student center, student union, a true student union, not just a place to eat and pick up your mail. And after about a year and a half, talking to his senior staff, talking to prospective students, parents, and students on campus, they started doing informal survey, and they said, what's most important to a student in a residential environment? Where do they spend their most time? And it's really in their dormitory. And then it's in their academic center, the library, and wellness center. So they said, well, how do we look in those areas? And really for the incoming students who are going to go into the 9th Street dorms, not the newer 6th Street dorms, because those are mostly upperclassmen, it said, well, how do we look where they spend most of their time on campus? We don't look so well. But yet, that's who we're trying to attract. So Dr. Wyatt and the Board of Trustees now believe that the most important thing we can do is not deal with a new student union, which the lower floor was paid for and renovated by Aramark, our food contractor, a year ago. And if you go into the upper part, you'll see architectural design. Aramark is redoing the whole upstairs main dining area this summer. So our students went home seeing that architectural design, knowing that when they come back to Monmouth in the fall, Aramark will have renovated that. So we're gonna give that a longer lifespan now. So we put that on the shelf, and we start renovating the 9th Street dorms. And it's just in the process of being finalized by the administration and the trustees. But they can take a dorm offline, renovate it, hop to the next one, and leapfrog down 9th Street until all 5 of those dorms are renovated. And you can do that for $2.5 million, which I know in our lives is a lot of money, right? But it's worth it when you think about how many students, freshmen and sophomores, you're trying to attract and trying to retain at Monmouth College. That investment is a priority. And the HT piece, like Jeff said, new student union down the road, you got your physical plan underground. Another idea is, can you connect the student union with a walkway or an elevated bridge between the library and the galleries and the student union, so you have this connectivity in the core of your campus of academic excellence and student life. And so this is like at the beginning of conversation, that piece, but you can begin to imagine how that center campus could be better utilized.
Any other questions? Yes.
Is there co-ed dormitory life, or do you
Yes.
have men's dormitories or women's?
Yes, there is both. There are all different. They're not co-ed by room, but they're co-ed by is it by floor or
By floor.
Floor, yeah. And you know, and it's very popular. And actually, I think it does tend to be a good situation. I feel like, you know, the rooms are better kept up. There's a better sense of, you know, being quieter and more responsible when you mix those sexes in the same facility. Yeah.
How many international students are there today, and are there particular countries that are more represented than others?
Yes, we've increased significantly. I believe about 40 years ago we had maybe five countries or something, and we have 25 countries this year. I don't know what the total number count is.
82.
82, yeah. But we have quite a cross-section, and you may have heard in the national news when we had our Syrian students come in. It was about 4 years ago. We had, it was through the State Department, we were able to get about 22 students from Syria. They weren't coming directly from Syria. They were coming from Jordan and other places. They found great refuge here. They found a community. They integrated very well with our students. They joined fraternities and sororities. So that's a really nice story. Another thing, you know, for years we had students come for a semester or a year from other countries. Our focus is having them come for 4 years and getting a degree, and that's what's really changed. But you know, it's a tough thing. There's markets out there in China and Vietnam, India. And there are people with the ability to pay from those places, so it's got to be part of our enrollment plan. But it has really, as you'll see, the old Theta Chi House, it's now our intercultural center. There's much more vibrance, I would say, with the number of international students we've been able to attract. Yeah.
There's one place where the campus has gone backward. Seems to me there's one place where the campus has gone backward. When I lived at Fulton, we had at least one phone per.
Or you might argue there's too many phones because you see students walking along and they don't. That's all they can do. So. Yeah.
What percentage of the student body is involved in the Greek organizations, Jeff?
I think it's 32%.
And is the college social life oriented around the Greek system as it was when we were here, or is it college?
Yeah, not so much. There are various social things. Athletics is one, so you'll have, you know, athletic teams, softball or whatever, they tend to congregate together a lot. Or other interests, you know, theater and that sort of thing. But really the Greek system, it's not like the focal point of social life. It's within each fraternity, you know, there is brotherhood and sisterhood, but not so much where they're doing all the campus events and that sort of thing. Yeah.
What's the endowment right now?
Just went over about 100 million.
103.
103. Yeah, it was up over 100, and then it was down a little bit. But you know, when you look.
And that's from 1 million. How many years ago?
Oh, it was probably not much over $1 million in the early '80s, before Walter Hess gave his first gift. 3 million maybe at that point. Yeah. So it's increased a lot, but we're still, you know, I think we probably need to get up to about 150 million in order to be where we need to be for a while.
So, yeah, a real good goal, intermediate goal that we're looking at is $100,000 of endowment per student. And so, you know, the next step is how do you go from 103 million to 130 million? And how long is that going to take? What's that look like? And sustaining current operations and taking care of the fair wear and tear on your campus infrastructure, because not only do we have 103 million in endowment, you have 200 million in real capital, your physical plant. So you're really looking at a college with assets just over 300 million and a debt load that's really reasonable, a fraction of that. So our footing is good. We're not Grinnell, so you know we don't have 1.6 billion in endowment. Wish we did, but we don't. But we're also better. We're better than most. And one of the challenges that you were asking Jeff about in higher ed, and General brought this up, but is kind of like working a flood operation with a levee system. The only people who really are directly impacted fiercely during a levee break are the people who are at the break. Everybody else along the system benefits from the relief and the pressure. And there's a lot of pressure in higher ed right now. And you have 254 like-type liberal arts colleges spread out throughout the United States trying to get less than 3% of the market share. Less than 3% of the market share. And so that is the world that we're recruiting from and trying to sustain out of. The universities, the land grants, the publics, they have a different problem. Their funding streams being cut by state government and federal government. So there's two different, distinctly different challenges out there, but you know, we don't want to be at the point of the break.
Yes.
I'd like to know a little bit about the Monmouth College student programs for students to study off campus, both domestically and abroad. 4 of us in the class of '62 went to the Washington semester program.
Right, right.
And that changed a lot for me. I'm just curious about how many get accredited studies off campus.
Yeah, I wish I had that figure. Can you talk about that, Steve?
Mr. What was the question?
About accredited off-campus study opportunities, like how many we have, and
yeah, so I don't have an exact number. Most of them are through our consortium, the 14 colleges that make up the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. Most of them are through that. We do have our own program that just started in Mexico, which is a Monmouth. But even our urban studies program, which is in Chicago, inner city, and also the Washington, D.C. program, which is diplomatic services, are part of the greater ACM. But we have a footprint in South America through the ACM, in Africa, West Africa, and also in numerous locations in Europe and Japan.
Thank you, thank you.
we're doing a lot of off-campus short research trips with faculty that are funded, a lot of them by alumni. So that's been really popular.
To go along with that, Jeff, Jeff may have mentioned this, but if you haven't grabbed one, you need to grab a hold of the Midwest Journal for Undergraduate Research. It is a peer-reviewed journal. There's only two or three of these type of undergraduate journals being published in the United States. A lot of graduate schools put out peer-reviewed professional journals. Monmouth is one of the few that's putting this out, and it's done right here. It's wonderful. It's an endowed program, and you should touch it. It's just that it's not written by Monmouth students. We do have a couple entries, but there's people on. What do they have, like over 180 submissions this year, and you can only publish so many in the journal. But we got people sending us articles from students from Notre Dame and from Case Western and University of Iowa and McAllister and Coe and Knox, and it's really a great journal. So when you look at academic niches, that's one of them.
Yes. Last week, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, there was a major article about critical thinking, and they're measuring the ability of students to think critically on various campuses, including Harvard. And it made me think that I really appreciate the education I got here. So how do you view critical thinking? How do you measure it? How do you gauge it here at Monmouth to perpetuate what I think is an advantage of a liberal arts education?
I think that's a big part of our, we have a 4-year kind of plan where each year you focus on a different aspect of the liberal arts, come to appreciate, all the things that liberal arts provide. So we hear it all the time, students who go on to graduate school, they say, I was so much more prepared than somebody that went to a state school. I knew how to write, a research paper. I knew how to do all this. And it was true in the 50s. I think it's equally true now. There's a lot of attention to critical thinking, and you know, not just in certain departments, but I think college-wide.
Yeah, that article was, what, Wednesday in Wall
Yes.
Street Journal?
Even students at Harvard were faring poorly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very poor. We got Introduction to Liberal Arts, Reflections, so sense of place, sense of self, citizenship, and global perspectives. And so you coalesce all your learning within disciplines around that learning.
And a lot of them, students, when they come here, they don't really have an understanding or appreciation for it, but because they're through that structured process, they come to really understand the liberal arts and appreciate it. Yeah.
Question for you, Mark. Who's in the ACM, and what kind of programs do we get from being part of the ACM?
Okay, so the ACM is currently hosted by Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa, and that's their footprint. See, like, so Carleton, Lawrence University, Beloit, Ripon, St. Olaf, McAllister, Colorado College, Knox, Monmouth, Cornell, Grinnell, and Co.
Lake Forest as well.
Lake
Luther,
Forest,
Luther, thank you.
Luther's been added.
And so the programs we get, a lot of it is, there's some faculty, like new faculty training, so understanding administration of a college, you know, how is a college administrators doing their job under this structure of co-governance. So that's a piece. The study abroad is a piece. They also do colloquiums and symposiums for professional development training for faculty. Those are probably the big pieces.
In our era, and this is into the 60s now, students did a lot of the lab assisting in sciences. How is that continuing?
Very much so, and as I mentioned, we have a lot of more student-faculty collaboration and research in the summer and throughout the year. So yeah, it's still a really big part of the sciences.
Hey Jeff, I think we're gonna have to get, but let's give Jeff a round of applause.